Hi, and welcome to the Thank God for the Beatles podcast, episode 003. If this is your first time, thank you so much for joining us. If you're returning, we really appreciate it. I'm Karen, your co-host, and today we're going to talk about the Beatles' recording techniques, their innovations, their inventions, all of the great ideas that they undertook with George Martin and his staff at Abbey Road to truly make influential music that has impacted how artists record today. And it can get pretty geeky tech here. And in order to have this conversation, I needed one person to join me tonight. And that is my dear friend, Scott Hamilton, who's going to be our co-host. And let me just share a little bit about Scott. Scott is one hell of a musician. He's a brilliant producer, engineer, songwriter, and someone who can play all the instruments, although his primary instrument is drums, but he can play them all, and he can hear how everything works sonically within songs, take things apart. And honestly, you can recreate songs to the dime. Your ear is unmatched as far as anyone that I know. And, my father had perfect pitch as a trumpet player with Woody Herman. So I have the utmost respect for you. And thank you for joining us, Scott.
Well, thanks for having me, Karen. I really appreciate that. And you're right, the drums are my main instrument. And I have something in common with Ringo Starr, actually, is that we are both left-handed people playing on a right-handed kit. And so I have a lot of empathy for the difficulty that presents. I'm very, very left-handed. And so I have some unusual fill patterns, and I keep a second floor tom to my left to do some things with that as well. But I feel like I have kind of a kindred spirit thing there with Ringo on the lefty-righty thing.
And do some of your techniques match up to how he did things? Is it
because
similar?
there's space that I can't do like a really fast like heavy metal all the way down the drums because it's just backwards for me. So I have a lot more spaciness and air in my fills, which he does too. So and he talks about that, and I totally get that about his playing, and I can relate to that as a fellow drummer.
I think they did a video with like Dave Grohl or something, and they were kind of analyzing Ringo's technique and saying how being a left-handed player made him unique.
Yeah.
So
I can relate to that.
Now, how do we know each other, Scott?
Well, it's a long story. We've known each other for 30 years now, and I had moved to Washington, D.C. in 1990, just after college, and I put an ad in a probably defunct now City Paper, is what it was called. And it was a classified ad saying I'm looking for fellow musicians to play with, to jam with, to record with. And I listed a whole bunch of bands because I have a bunch of influences. And one of them happened to be the Beatles, and that caught Karen's eye. And so she responded to my ad. And we met at a restaurant, I believe an Italian place in Bethesda, right on Cordell Avenue, if I remember correctly.
That's right. That's right.
And just had a really wonderful conversation from there, and started writing some music together and playing together and just jamming, and of course talking about the Beatles quite a bit as we were doing all that. And 30 years later, we've done several records together and maintained a wonderful friendship through 30 years.
And, we were really a part of the home studio recording at that time I had a Tascam Porta Studio, and I got a fancier 4-track Porta Studio, and then I ultimately got an 8-track, which we used to record our demos. And then we took our songs and recorded in a 24-track studio, and which was a big deal at the time.
It was a luxury, and shoot, even having a 8-track at home was above and beyond what most people had. And I just felt like a kid in the candy store. I could actually record drums in stereo, and I thought that was just the greatest thing. And now we have unlimited tracks, and you just kind of take that for granted. But back then you really had to choreograph not only your recording, like what went on which tracks and which ones you bounced, but also your mix down was a big choreographed routine where you're pulling faders up and down at certain points in the song. And so the mix itself was a performance, not just the automated things that we do now with the digital technology.
So hold that thought, because we'll get to that as we talk about the Beatles' early recording. But one thing that Scott and I were really fortunate to do is that we were able to go to the Birchmere in Alexandria, Virginia, to listen to George Martin speak about recording Sgt. Pepper, probably in the late 90s,
Yeah.
like the 25th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper. He had written a book. There was a special on maybe PBS or something about the making of Sgt. Pepper. And you think about how lucky we are.
It was a night I'll never forget. I was just struck by how humble he was too, and how he talked about his experiences and what a honor it was to work with the Beatles. And yet the Beatles owe so much to him in terms of so many of the things that we credit to the Beatles as being innovative were actually George Martin influenced, and his team and his staff. And he was just so incredibly humble, but just so pleased also to talk about his memories and working with them. And it was just to see a legend like that in person was just something I'll never forget.
And not only that, but his experience and his willingness to break the rules at EMI and to let things go. I think that he just realized and saw the desire and the passion within the Beatles to do so. So in those early days in recording that first album, they had basically 2 sessions scheduled for one day. And they added a third schedule, and this was the Please Please Me album. I believe it was in February of '63. And what was interesting is that one of the tape operators, they were breaking after the second session for lunch. Maybe that was after the first session, but breaking for lunch, and normally the artist would leave. And the Beatles did not. They stayed, they drank milk, and they rehearsed their songs. And the people who were working at the studio were in shock because nobody did that. And it just goes to show you right then and there, that's the essence of who they were.
Yeah, for sure. Everything was so regimented and so scripted in terms of time, and the staff there wore suits and ties. I mean, it was dress up to do the recording, and that seems kind of silly now, but it was a very highly scripted, on off with times, and there was no overtime. So you either got it in the time that you had, or you didn't get it, and so lots of changes, not only technologically that happened in the 60s, but also just the process of recording and how we go about creating records really changed. And the Beatles' experience in the 60s had a lot to do with that, and a lot of things that are standard now.
So tell me how that first album would have been recorded. Would it be primarily live with the mics and the the guitar and maybe the drums on one first track, or how would they do that?
Yeah, the first 2 albums actually were recorded in just 2-track. And I believe they were more interested in the mono tracks back then more than stereo even. But it was all cut live, and there's no overdubbing. And so you had to not only get your performance down well, but you also had all the levels right. You had to have a sound check that was very precise, that the drums weren't too loud or too quiet, and the guitars were in the right place, and so everything had to be just right. And then you had to play it through, and so they would just play the whole song through over and over again until they got a take that they really liked. And so the first 2 records, that was largely the way they did that. And gosh, we take for granted now that we can go back and fix things, and says there's no repairing of flubs on a track like there is now.
Well, I believe that at the time, George Martin, by rule at EMI, they had to record on 2 tracks, but the classical artists could have the 4-track tape machine. So he lobbied to get permission to be able to use that 4-track. And then they brought that in, and I think they only saved maybe the 4th track for overdubs, harmonies. Mm-hmm. Could you explain for people who aren't familiar with the bouncing technique of why it was important to be efficient and to be wise and to pre-plan perhaps your recording?
Yeah. So I believe the first Beatles record done on 4-track was I Want to Hold Your Hand. I believe that was the first 4-track recording they did. And so what you do when you bounce, and this is something we even did when we had our own 4-track, and even our 8-track, we could do it. So you have 4 tracks, unlike a regular cassette, which a regular cassette player just has a playback head, 1 for each side. A 4-track has 4 playback and 4 record heads. And so you can split the tape into basically 4 little micro units where each track has its own space on that tape. And so that creates the 4 tracks. And so what you would do is you would typically record your instrumental tracks on, let's say 1, 2, and 3, but then, oh no, we've got all these other things we want to overdub, vocals and things. We only got one track left. What do we do? So what they would do is they would do a bounce down, and they would take the 3 tracks, 1, 2, and 3, and mix them together, get it sounding the balance as best they could, and then they would put that on track number 4. And then they could erase over tracks 1, 2, and 3 and put more tracks on there.
So you lose the original first 3. Say if you bounced them down, you would lose like the first. If you bounced the first 2, you would lose them.
Yeah, once you erase over them, once you've bounced it and you start to erase over, there's no going back. So you have to be very careful that what you get on that bounce is exactly what you want. There's a couple of problems with it. One is you do lose a little fidelity when you bounce. Anytime you're with analog tape that you're moving from one cassette to another part of a tape, you're going to lose a little fidelity. You're going to add a little more tape hiss. And the other thing too is you have to have it perfect. It has to be right because there's no going back once you start to erase over those other 3 tracks. And so theoretically you could do this forever, but the more you bounce, the more you lose the original fidelity of the sound. So they tried to do it just once usually when they would do this, and then they would fill up the other 3 tracks with the vocals.
So on that first album with the song Misery, it's where George Martin's expertise came into play, where he, I don't know that he was that happy with George Harrison's guitar work on the song for maybe a solo. It was lacking something. And so his idea was to record a piano piece to mimic the guitar at half speed. And I believe that when you play it, it plays twice as fast. So it kind of mirrored, it made this very weird sounding ding, 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 ding. Remember, that part of the, I don't know the song.
Yeah.
So that was the beginning of a technique that they used throughout their career. Rocky Raccoon, it sounds like the dance hall, what do you call those old
kind of a saloon piano,
saloon
like that
style piano. In My Life, which we all thought was a harpsichord. It's not. It's the piano, which is again has the wind up, recorded at a different speed. You Never Give Me Your Money. I'm sure there are a couple other ones as well. So interesting. Again, the Beatles are probably saying, "Yeah, do whatever," because they were so differential to George, as they should be.
Yeah. And back then they had to be very clever with their how they did the tape speed too, because some of the earlier machines didn't actually have a vari speed slider on it that you could actually change the speed. So they actually had to use what's called an oscillator and use that to actually drive the motor of the tape head. And they would vary vary the electric current that went to the tape head to slow it down or speed it up. And so back in the early days, they had to really be creative and really get into their physics knowledge to create variable speed with the tape machines that they were using.
And these engineers that worked with George Martin, they were very young. I believe that Jeff Emmerich started working at Abbey Road when he was like 15 or 16.
Yeah, that's right.
And imagine, we'll get to that later as he took over the lead role of engineer when he was probably 19 years old. And so it's just, that part is mind-boggling. So one of the things, what do we know about mono versus stereo? We know that it was a mono mix really up until Sgt. Pepper. That the stereo mix was like a afterthought, that they wanted to mix for vinyl. They wanted to mix for mono. What's the benefit of mono?
Well, I think it was largely they were thinking about what most people were playing their music on back then. That stereo had been around since the 50s, but you got to think, first of all, AM radio was in mono, and that was the largest. FM radio didn't have the market share that AM radio had back then. So they were thinking about radio play, but then also people were listening on single earpieces or on a mono record player at home. And so they wanted to make the sound as accessible for what they thought most people were going to be listening to it on. And they spent a lot more time perfecting the mono mixes than they did the stereo mixes. And if you listen to the early stereo mixes, they're kind of funny. They have everything, like the vocals are all on one side and the guitars are all on another, and the drums maybe all, and it's this extremely hard panned left right type of thing, which I thought was kind of fun actually, because you could actually listen to the stereo mixes and pick out things, and
You could isolate things.
and isolate things. Yeah.
Yes.
If you listen to, this is a little geeky thing, but if you listen to the old stereo mix of Day Tripper, you will hear a couple of times where one person's guitar drops out, a couple of times in the verses. The guitar just drops out for a second and then comes back on. Probably it was a mistake and they probably just pulled it down to get rid of it. And in the mono mix, you'd never notice that. But in the stereo mix, when you hear just the guitars by themselves, you can hear these little dropouts on the guitars. And I remember being in a high school band and we played Day Tripper, and I practiced to that by listening to it on my Walkman. I'm dating myself how old I am now. And I would have one of the speakers off and I would just hear the guitars and the bass, and I didn't have Ringo's drum track. So I could literally like do almost like a drummer -1 type of thing with the actual Day Tripper stereo recording. The other thing that was, and I remember George Harrison complaining about this, is in those stereo mixes, how some of the percussion was just so loud. Like the tambourine in Day Tripper again is just overwhelmingly loud, and you just don't have the same kind of balance and the nuance that they had with the mono mixes. And even up to Sgt. Pepper, when we're getting into more sophisticated recording times, they spent 3 weeks doing the mono master of Sgt. Pepper, and I think they spent 2 days on the stereo. So even a seminal record like that, they just, mono was still king.
Well, for I don't know if it was the mono mix, but in If I Fell, when Paul's voice cuts as he's singing it, his voice goes out, and there's a whole website that's devoted to all the different, what you can hear on the mono versus the stereo and the little fixes, and how John and Paul would mess up the lyrics. And if you listen carefully, I think you can hear how they were way off on some of these things. So it is interesting, and it's so interesting. What Jeff Emmerich said is, he said that he prefers the mono mixes to the stereo. He doesn't even care for any of the CD releases, and this is obviously before he passed away like 2 years ago, that the songs were meant to be listened on vinyl and were meant to be listened to mono. And for those mono, it's everything sounded in the center, right? Is that kind of the goal?
Yep. It's all kind of blended together. And I love stereo, and I love, when I record, panning is a very important part of my recording process. And that's where panning means where in the stereo field is a particular instrument. And that to me is very important, to make sure your parts are not competing with each other, and each part has its own space in the stereo field. And so that to me is crucial in the recording process. And I wonder what Jeff would have thought of the newest remastered Sgt. Pepper that I got that a couple years ago, and it's mind-blowing to me. There's things on there, I've listened to that record hundreds of times, and there's things on there I never heard until I heard the remastered stereo. It was like a brand new experience, and it was quite enjoyable.
I like the remix of Sgt. Pepper. I'm not a fan of the White Album remix.
What do you not like about that one?
I think that's, again, some of the percussion came up too much. I think it was a reason why it was put down a little bit. And I just felt like it wasn't quite as it should have been, as it should have sounded as the Beatles wanted it. So do you have that Super Deluxe?
I haven't gotten that one.
You know what? That is worth every penny. And also for the outtakes. And I'll just leave it at that. That's well worth getting that. So, what's interesting about the Beatles is that happy accidents, and with feedback, John Lennon, they were all recording in the studio one day and probably talking to Paul, and he put down his acoustic Gibson guitar that had a single pickup, right by the sound hole.
Semi hollow body, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Laid it against a amp that was on, and it made that sound. And they were like, "Oh my God, what's that?" And so they liked it. Now, Abbey Road and EMI had a rule against feedback like that or distortion, which you cannot do that ever. So that was like at one session, and then they purposely brought it back for John and Paul's "I Feel Fine," and recreated it. And then I think Paul hit like an A note on the bass and it
That's
let
right.
that ring out. And then it went into that. That was like the first #1 single that had that feedback. Again, it's the openness and the willingness of George Martin to say, we're going to break the rules here.
Yeah,
So,
and it fits sociologically so well with the '60s in terms of experimenting and mind expanding and pushing boundaries. And it just, I love how the zeitgeist of the '60s also translated into Abbey Road Studios, that we're going to push some boundaries and we're going to, like on Paperback Writer, we're going to crank the bass guitar up and make it loud enough to make people's needles jump off their turntables, and
which
we're going
was
to
a
put,
valid concern. They thought that it would jump off,
yeah,
and that it was Jeff Emmerich who I think said that they were happy that this certain guy cut the tape or made it happen. Otherwise, if they had used someone else, they might have pulled it back down. So as the Beatles start to take a break from touring and this insane pressure to make singles, to produce singles, and the singles were not to be on albums, and they finally had some time to record, and so they started recording with Rubber Soul, and I think that was like October 12th to November 15th. And that to me, mind-boggling.
to make a record like that in 5 weeks.
Mind-boggling that
Yeah.
it takes 5 weeks sometimes to write a song.
Yeah.
And to edit that. So here's Rubber Soul, and one of the things was the song Rain. What do you notice, and what can you share with us about the drums?
Well, I think it's actually Ringo, and Ringo actually says it himself. It's one of his proudest drumming moments. He does some really cool fills, and again, they're just off the traditional fill spots, and he's doing this really cool interplay with the hi-hat and the snare. So the playing itself is some of Ringo's best playing. But the other thing that you'll notice about it is the pitch, and you can especially tell on the cymbal crashes. If you ever want to tell a Beatles track that's been pitched down on the drums and manipulated, listen to the cymbal crashes, because they have a distinctive lower ring to them. And you can hear that on Rain pretty clearly. And the snare drum has kind of a very low, almost John Bonham-like quality to it in terms of the pitch. And the guitars were pitched down on that too. So they were recorded faster, and then the tape was slowed down. So it just gives it a different tonal quality for the drums as well as for the guitar. And it just creates a unique sound and something unlike what other people have been doing.
And it was the use of the backward last phrase that John said, and the backstory on that was, they all have a different story. John Lennon says that he was stoned and he was home, and he put the tape into the tape reel the wrong way, and
that's what I heard,
came in and said, "This is brilliant." And then George Harrison's like, "Yeah, that's what happened." And then George Martin's like, "No, I used to do this with my, the comedy music that I used to do. I suggested it." So it is funny to read the different accounts of who's doing what. But Jeff Emmerich states in his book, he says, once they figured out that backwards, everything then turned to backwards forever. Guitars, you name it. And that's so interesting. Again, it's the kids in the candy store. It's like, oh, give us more.
Exactly. And using the studio as a writing tool, I think, is what really made the mid to late '60s Beatles special. Is that you didn't have to come in with your songs all prepped and ready to go, and you just cut them in the studio. You can actually use the studio space as a way to create new music and to create new sounds and to try new things and to see what worked and what didn't work. And some things they tried were more successful than others, but just having that kind of freedom to create and use technology at the time, and to have the freedom to have the free reign of the studio, I think is what led to some of the greatest tracks that came out of that.
Well, they had the success and they had the money, and the record label allowed them the freedom to take their time, because then they started to record till late in the evening, early hours. They had that luxury of doing that. I think that George Martin said that it was where the recording studio became another instrument of learning how to really just manipulate anything in order to improve the songs. And again, it goes to the genius of the Beatles, which is maybe another band is done within a week. Oh, those are good enough. Yep, we're good to go. But to do during the Rubber Soul, to do 15 takes or to do 12 takes, that's a lot. And on Rubber Soul, Paul's playing, I think, a fuzz bass on Think for Yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think he'd gotten the Rickenbacker, which was a solid state bass, one I have back here. And they went capo crazy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
All these new techniques to bring into the songs.
Yeah. The sitar.
The sitar.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're also listening to American music, and they hear that it's recorded differently, that it's louder, and that the bass is recorded a little bit differently as well. And they wanted, I think, that urgency. So it kind of bleeds into, this incredible album of Rubber Soul, which, again, at the time, John Lennon called it their pot album because they were influenced by Bob Dylan. And I'm not sure if it was Rubber Soul. I'd have to double check, or Revolver, but one of the songs, it might have been Paperback Writer or something. They played for Bob Dylan. And what he said, oh, I see you guys are trying to not be seen as kids anymore. I don't think he said it that delicately or that nicely. It was more like a eh.
Mm-hmm.
So B.O.B. Bob, just later on, get out of here. Imagine if you're Bob Dylan and then the Beatles are growing like that.
Yeah, yeah. And especially when you hear a song like "I've Just Seen a Face," which is it sounds like a Bob Dylan song. It's like I guess imitation is the sincerest form of flattery.
Or you've got to hide your love away.
Yeah.
Now, I've Just Seen a Face. That false start. What version is that on? Is that a stereo or a mono?
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's a good question.
I don't know if they play. I don't know if that's on any of my newer mixes. To go back and think about that. So McCartney's bass, Jeff Emmerich, Paul wanted something bigger. And as you were saying with Paperback Writer, tell us what they're doing. What changed? Well, in the older days, I believe that they just mic'd his bass cabinet. They had another ambient mic, maybe 5 to 8 feet away, that was a figure eight, picked up the room. Mm-hmm. And they might have also done direct, but probably not yet.
I think direct came a little bit later, but the direct sound was definitely, with both the guitars and the bass, was something that the Beatles started to do quite a bit of. And for those of you who don't know what that means, as opposed to miking an amplifier like Karen just talked about, a direct injection is taking the pickup from the bass guitar or the electric guitar and putting it through what's called a DI box. And a DI box is something that matches the impedance of the flow of the current from the pickup, and it goes directly into the mixing board rather than being mic'd through an amplifier. So it's a way to put the sound directly into the board and theoretically directly onto the tape. And this is a very
clean signal.
Very clean signal. You don't get the room ambiance. It's really just the tones, and all the other frequencies are kind of canceled out because they're not being picked up by like a room microphone, for example. The other thing it enables you to do is it gets you more of a low end, the bottom end of things, that they really wanted to capture that low bass. And you listen to early Beatles records, and the bass is it's in there, but it's not really prominent. And then you start to listen to what's happening on Rubber Soul and Revolver and Sgt. Pepper, and he switches over to the Rickenbacker at some point. But there's just a real low end presence there. Another thing they started to do to try to get that really rumbly low tone is to actually use a speaker as a microphone. And people don't understand the physics of this, but a speaker is basically a transducer, so it can make signals go either way. And so what they would do is use a huge cone speaker and put that in front of Paul's cabinet, try to capture, with a bigger diaphragm, you can capture more of the low end wave forms that are coming out of that.
So you've got a bass speaker, and then you've got a loudspeaker like facing each other.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And the loudspeaker is being used as a microphone in that instance. And it's pretty common now. I don't know if you've ever noticed drummers now. You look at a drum kit and you'll see like a little disc basically in front of the bass drum. It's a little black disc. It's about the size of a small Frisbee. And you might wonder what that is. A good example is Questlove from The Roots has one of these on his drums, if you look on the Tonight Show. it's basically the same thing that they were doing in the 60s. That it's a big diaphragm that's trying to capture the real low tones of the bass drum, and it's the same physics and the same theory, 40, 50 years later. So that's a pretty popular miking technique now with bass drums, is to not only have the traditional, bass drum kick drum mic inside the hole, inside the machine, inside the bass drum, but also the little machine on the outside capturing. So it's kind of dually mic'd, and that thing, the big black thing you see is capturing the really lower tones, and they try to blend that together to get a really nice solid thud out of the bass drum.
Now, I've also read that they, for Ringo's drums, that his tom-toms were open on the bottom end, and so they would mic up through there. And that was something that was new. I think Sgt. Pepper, they used maybe 7 mics on his.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about mics, because that's another huge thing that we thank the Abbey Road and the Beatles staff for really changing the way things are mic'd. And Ringo's drums is one example of that. Back in the early era, in the early 60s, drums were typically, it's all done in, one take. And the drums were typically, there was maybe a microphone stuck a couple of feet in front of the bass drum, and then there was maybe an overhead mic kind of dangling over to capture the hi-hat and the toms and everything. So it's just basically two mono microphones capturing everything. And one of the themes with the miking with the Beatles is close miking. And you hear that on so many tracks. The sitar I mentioned earlier in Norwegian Wood, just really capturing all those really amazing tones that come out of that instrument. So having really close mics there. And then we got to talk about Eleanor Rigby as well. They had the double string quartet for that, and they were putting the microphones pretty much right on top of the violins and the violas, and it was freaking out the session musicians, because it was so unorthodox and so different for them, and just spooky almost to have just this microphone like right on top of them, and they wanted to capture that just in your face sound, and that's why that record sounds so good. Is that close miking that they did.
It's also like Got to Get You Into My Life
with the horns,
because Paul's hearing this in American radio and Motown sounds, and he wants that, and so they're miking these poor musicians who are the best of the best, and they're like, what in the hell? Because they didn't want their mistakes to be amplified. To be right. They made a mistake, and so
and that's why when you listen to "Got to Get You Into My Life," those horns are distorted. I mean, there's no doubt about that. There is. It's almost like there's a fuzz pedal on them, and it's because those mics are just getting overloaded, because they're just getting blasted with all the energy coming out of the ends of the horns, and so but it creates a real gritty sound.
Didn't they do ADT with those horns as well? Can you talk about the ADT as we talk about Revolver?
Yeah. So ADT stands for artificial double tracking. And so you'll notice in a lot of Beatles records, there's dual vocals, or sometimes somebody's doing their own vocal twice. And so it's a doubling effect. It's a fairly common thing, especially if people don't have the most powerful of voices to create. You basically record yourself twice, singing the part twice. You blend them together with some special techniques to make your voice just sound thicker. Perfect example of this is Sting. It's very hard to find any Police song where he's not double tracking his vocals. But John Lennon in particular, I think, was loath to do a track more than once, especially if he felt like he nailed it. And so Ken Townsend, the engineer there, came up with a very, very clever way of creating what's called artificial double tracking. And what they would do is they would take a tape machine, and their 4-track machines had 2 heads on them, a record head and a playback head. So they would take the signal from the recording head and output that to a second machine, and then record it on that, and then take the playback head of that second machine and feed it back to the first one. Okay. And again, remember I talked earlier about using the oscillator to change and affect the speed they would alter the speed of the second machine, so they could make it a little slower, a little faster. They could do all sorts of things to manipulate that. But the whole idea is that second signal coming back, even though it's the same recording, it's slightly delayed. It's slightly off in terms of the timing as well as the pitch, because the second machine is being pitch varied a little bit. So when you blend those two together, it's almost like we have two singers going, that they're slightly out of phase with each other, and they're slightly off pitch with each other, and it creates what's called this artificial double track. And
It's
if
a
you want
thickening agent in a
it's a thickening. It really does thicken.
Yeah.
If you want to listen to what I would recommend, if you really want to hear this, how this works, take Eleanor Rigby, put headphones on and listen to it. Listen to the verses that Paul sings, and then listen when the chorus comes in, all the lonely people part, the vocal changes. That's where the artificial double tracking starts right there. And you can hear it, and it's very clear because it's just the strings and the vocal. So if you want a perfect example of ADT, I would listen to Eleanor Rigby.
And that became standard on really everything that they did. All of their vocals.
Didn't Lennon call it the flangey thing?
Put your flangey thing on. So on Revolver, again, the luxury of time. They had some space. They also had been indulging in, hallucin LSD and stuff. So they had a very different idea of approaching life. And it was the songs with Rubber Soul, and then moving on, the songs changed, as we all know, from the love songs to songs that are ambiguous, like Norwegian Wood, and theme songs, bigger songs of loneliness, like Eleanor Rigby. Maybe should we talk about Tomorrow Never Knows now, because it kind of sets the stage. It's really the benchmark or the milestone, I think, of that album.
Yeah, that's my favorite Beatles song of all time too. So I'd love to talk about that one. A one-note song, out of all the beautiful melodies and songs they wrote, that one just gets to me, just because it's so out there in terms of just
totally out there,
so ahead of its time, and
yes.
and so random, for lack of a better word, that it just worked. The chaos of it made it sound very deliberate in terms of how they put it all together.
Well, what's interesting with Tomorrow Never Knows, and it's the style of McCartney versus Lennon. McCartney would tell you exactly and tell George, this is what I hear, and these are the notes. So For No One, on that one of the tracks there, they had a great guy come in and play. I think was it a French horn that they came in and played, or is it?
Yeah, it's French horn or
the piccolo trumpet was in
yeah.
another song, I think.
Yeah.
I think that was Penny Lane.
Mm-hmm.
But so he's articulating the notes. John comes in and says, I want it to sound like 1,000 Tibetan monks chanting, and I'm the Dalai Lama singing on the mountaintop. So John, as Jeff Emmerich said, he couldn't even move a fader on the board. Paul, knew exactly. So two different styles from that, but, the drone of what, I guess that Paul did some tape loops at home on his Brunel tape recorders.
Mm-hmm.
And he brought in like 16 loops of different things, him playing distorted bass, guitar, wine glasses, and that they picked 5 of them to use.
Yeah. And the most famous one is the one that everyone says sounds like a seagull, which is, I think, Paul laughing and being pitch shifted. And that's the one that people stand out the most on that one. And
then George brought in the tambora, I guess, and the idea of that drone. It's amazing. Did the backwards have the reverse drums and cymbals?
I don't know if there's reverse drums on that. There's definitely reversed
cymbals. I think something is.
There could be the Indian instruments. Certainly, there's some lead parts and guitar that are backwards on that as well. I think there was a mellotron on it. Mm-hmm. That was the song. I'm looking at my notes. That was a song where Bob Dylan said, "Oh, I get it. You don't want to be cute anymore." Yeah, bastard. I think my favorite thing in that, though, is the third verse, where they use the Leslie speaker on the vocal. And for those of you who don't know what that is, a Leslie cabinet is typically used with a Hammond organ, and it's a rotating speaker. It's literally a speaker that's spinning. And it's using, if you remember your high school physics class, it's the Doppler shift is what that is. And so just when you're standing outside and you hear a fire truck coming towards you, the pitch is lower, then it gets higher, 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 then it gets lower as it goes away. because of distance, and that takes the sound time to travel. It changes the frequency and the pitch that we hear, even when the frequency is steady. So with a rotating speaker, as this speaker is moving around and you have it mic'd, there's going to be a little bit of a pitch shifting with that as it moves backwards and forwards, and it creates that really nice swirly Hammond organ. It's kind of the classic Hammond organ sound when people pop that on. Guy I play in the band with, the band I play with here, I play in a 70s disco cover band, and he has a Leslie cabinet, and we actually recorded a track with it once, and it was just a joy to listen to this thing, to see this thing working, this wonderful piece of machinery working. And but what they decided to do was rig it so Lennon's vocals went through the Leslie speaker. So that third verse that you hear, it's the speakers being rotated like that, and it creates this really psychedelic sound, and it's just a joy to listen to that, especially with headphones on. It's just really
but
cool.
It has the mountaintop feel that he wanted.
Yeah, it's the Tibetan.
It's such a change from the other verses.
Yep.
And that just goes to show you when you're producing, it's something I learned from you, which is something has to change in each part of the song to make it interesting.
It has to build to something. Yeah.
Klaus Vorman was the artist who designed the cover for Revolver, and it's such a great album cover. And he was a bass player, and he played bass for John's Plastic Ono band, I believe, in the 70s.
I did not know that.
What he said at the time, listening to Tomorrow Never Knows, that it was frightening. And he said it was frightening because he was thinking about the typical Beatle fan who's listening to this and going, what in the hell am I hearing? I want my cute Beatles back.
Exactly.
And here I've got this, turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream.
Yeah.
Direct quote from
Timothy Leary.
Yeah, and really a direct quote. I mean,
yeah,
really.
Literally.
Yes, I know. But it was reading the Tibetan Book of the Dead, so...
these innovative artists in the 60s, that are, out on the cutting edge, they had to, just have faith in their art. I mean, just, the pushback that Brian Wilson got when he did Pet Sounds, that the record company almost didn't want to release, one of the greatest records of all time, because it was just not, singing about surfing in cars. And so,
not only that, but
instrument
Mike Love didn't like it.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah.
And he was, genius can be really quite complicated for people. But, I'm going to just say this Jeff Emmerich book is amazing. And one of the things he talks about in here is Taxman, which is the lead-off song. And, George had 3 songs on Revolver. And George Martin typically picked the running order for the earlier albums. And he put this one first. George had such a, I think, lack of confidence in his guitar playing, and George Emmerich, and I don't know that this is true or not, this is from his perspective, that George would struggle doing a guitar solo, like take after take after take, and it was Paul and George Martin were getting very frustrated with Harrison and said, well, we're going to have Paul play the lead on Taxman. George Harrison went off and sulked for a bit. Then he came back. And of course, in 2 takes, Paul plays this ripping, amazing guitar solo. Can do anything. And I'm sure George was fine, but it's, George started to come into his own on really Revolver, where his input was respected and actually recorded. What other songs, strike you as, something special, that's we've got to get you into my life. 401 is, I think, on this album, is it?
Yeah.
Again, it's the sadness of relationships. You can hear that in that song. How they're young men, but they're writing with such angst and real life-ism. It's a very different feeling than the other happy stuff that they were doing. I'm just trying to think off the top of my head what else is on that album.
Dr. Robert.
It's okay.
I think that's a drug.
She said, when they were doing they were getting ready to do the final mix of Revolver, and they were short a song. So they went in there and then John had She Said, which was based on their trip to LA where they were doing LSD with Peter Fonda. And that's, I think, what Peter Fonda said, the late Peter Fonda said, he knew what it was like to be dead.
Hmm.
So, and Jeff Emmerich described it as a rough song, probably not one of their best, but it's a very mature sounding album. And they had the very speed of the tape, but they also then, as they moved into Sergeant Pepper, they moved into the tape syncing, and particularly with Strawberry Fields Forever. Maybe you want to share about.
Yeah. So there was a technology that did come out called SMPTE, and it's actually still used now as a way to get tape machines to talk to each other. And you can basically put a tone on one of the tracks of one of the tape machines, and it'll basically drive the other tape machine through electronic circuitry and keep them in sync with each other. And they had to kind of improvise that a little bit when they were recording Sergeant Pepper, in particular, Day in the Life. They had the basic tracks going, but then they wanted to have more tracks freed up for the big orchestra crescendo. So they were able to rig the two machines together. And actually, it was very crudely how they did it. They would actually mark on the tape with a little wax pen exactly where each one was supposed to start. And then they still had to hit record and play at the same time on the two machines to get them going at the same time. But it would, this tone that they put like a 50 hertz tone on one of the tracks to drive the other one and keep the two machines in sync. And it was innovative and it was ahead of its time, and it worked to make that happen. But what would happen was it's machine specific, and every machine has its own little peccadillos back then. And so what would happen is you would take the tape and you put it on a different machine, and it wouldn't sync up the same way. So it's not as standard as digital is now, where everything's pretty much the same. We're using the same waveforms and the same sampling rate and all those kind of things that happen in the modern studio. But back then it was machine by machine. And then the early 70s is when SMPTE really started to happen. And that tone is still used today as part of the industry.
Well, in Sergeant Pepper, you've got, again, the MVP maybe might be the Abbey Road sound effect locker. They were able to pull out all of the, the animal sounds for Good Morning, or I think it was Good Morning. Not
yeah.
It's the end of Good Morning, Good Morning.
Yeah.
And the steam engine sounds of steam organ sounds, for
being for the benefit
of Mr. Kite.
Yeah. And that's another example of that randomness, that the story is that they had all those clips and they just cut them up and threw them in the air and then randomly taped them together. I don't know if that really happened, but the legend of that's pretty fun to think about, just that how it randomly, and it sounds like it was designed to be that way. And just that randomness is just really cool. And that actually carried over. Emmerich did a lot of work with Pink Floyd at Abbey Road in the 70s. And there was a lot of, you think about Dark Side of the Moon and Animals and some of those, Wish You Were Here. There's a lot of those kind of random accident type of things that happen on those records as well. So that theme of we want to just create sound and just have it kind of happen organically is definitely an Abbey Road staple.
Well, and even to think that Strawberry Fields Forever and I believe Penny Lane were recorded at the same time and not even on that album.
I know. They were A/B singles, I think.
Mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And with Penny Lane, I think that they were working on building several piano parts to create a denser rhythm. So constant innovation.
Yep.
What else was happening on again, I think a lot of use of the Leslie was used, maybe on Lovely Rita. They also sped that up.
Yep. Some tape echo as well there. A lot of tape speed variation too on the vocals on that record in particular. When I'm 64, they sped it up to make Paul sound like a real super young, like a teenager almost. So his voice is really high on that. You think about Lovely Rita, John's backing vocals are echoed very heavily, but also pitched up as well. A lot of very speed on the drums. Ringo's drums sound just cavernous on Sergeant Pepper, and you think about the fills on Like a Day in the Life and Lovely Rita, and so just these really low drums that come out there. So just lots of speed variation there with the taping.
Do you think that he was using the tea towels during Sergeant Pepper, or did he save that later for
I
a
think
White
that was
Album?
later. I think it was later. He switched drum kits at some point. I think right around probably when Get Back was recorded. He switched to those yellow. I think they were
Ludwig
Gretsch,
Maples.
Ludwig
Yeah.
Maples, and had the two rack toms instead of the one. So there was just some different sounding drums, but the the drum that I think are the most tea-toweled are, if you listen to Come Together, the fill at the beginning, the boom, that sounds like he's hitting books. I mean, they're just really, really dead sounding drums.
And it's not for everybody. Not everybody likes
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
And even his snare, I mean, some people like it pitched. I think that you like your snare a little bit higher. That's what I remember from our recordings. So it's,
yeah,
again, it's a preference for each drummer of how they want to do things.
yeah. I like the tight, cracky Stuart Copeland, Carter Beauford type of snare drum sound. It's kind of my favorite. And so, but I don't mind, the really heavy ones, the Bonham. The only drums I really don't like the sound of are like the 70s LA studio sound, where those drums are like super dead, like Don Henley's drums, I think, are the nastiest sounding drums of the 70s. Just that, listen to that song These Shoes, and just those drums just sound awful.
What about Hal Blaine?
Oh, he's amazing.
You like
Yeah,
his drums, how they
I do.
recorded it? Okay.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, and just
I,
I
I
like his playing too. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
What do you think of oh my God, who was I gonna say? This is just a random Phil Collins.
I like his earlier stuff, like his when he played with like the early Genesis. He was doing a lot of really like odd time signature, fusiony, prog rocky type of stuff, and then the poppy stuff is just not. It's just pretty bland drumming. But his drumming in the early days was really quite remarkable, and of course his drum sounds are pretty legendary. That
They are, but there was I think just that time when all drums sounded pretty weird. Like
mhm.
maybe it was the 80s. It was just I don't know. I can't describe it. I loved the sound of Ringo's drums. I love those
I
Ludwigs.
did too. I did too. The '80s drums they got into what's called gated reverb, which is and that was actually discovered by accident, based on there was a reverb that was on, but then there was also a gate on it that kind of cut it off really quickly, and they just said, "Oh wow, that sounds really cool. Let's do that some more." So a gated reverb is a reverb that doesn't naturally decay. Like if you go into a gymnasium and you yell, your voice echoes and it just kind of slowly dies down, whereas a gated reverb comes in full blast and then stops on a dime. And so like the drum fill on In the Air Tonight, the ba da 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 boom boom, that's gated
Yeah.
reverb. And
Okay.
that just became the '80s
Signature.
signature
Yeah.
reverb sound. You listen to Addicted to Love, the drums on that by Robert Palmer, this classic '80s drum sound. I never cared for that too much.
I agree. I agree.
So I like the more natural sounding drums, and I thought Ringo's drums sounded really good.
The White Album I thought was amazing.
Revolver, White Album,
Yeah.
with the exception of Come Together. I don't really like the toms on that one as much. But that middle era, I think, is when his drums sound really present and crisp, and a lot of that also has to do with the miking. Again, we talked about close miking. That was one of the areas where they were sticking mics right in front of the bass drum, which was sacrilege back in the early days to get it that close. They're worried about distorting their equipment, but just to really get that natural sound of the drums, I think was really an innovative thing, and that's where Ringo's drums started to sound really good.
Well, by the time they get to the White Album, the Beatles are somewhat frustrated because they really want 8-track, because they know that American studios have 8-track.
Mm-hmm.
Abbey Road had an 8-track machine, but at EMI Abbey Road, they would not bring out any new equipment until their engineers had a chance to take everything apart, every piece, reassemble it, and test the durability. Because what I read about their approach was that if we're, recording the London Symphony Orchestra, we can't afford for this new technology to break down. So it's a very interesting thing. So they've got it, but they haven't had the chance to bring it into the studio, and the Beatles were getting frustrated. Toward the later part of '68, I think they meet Magic Alex, who's like selling them a song about, I'm going to build a 72-track studio in your new Apple studio, and all he's building is like a box that has lights. in it. It was spinning light, and they're like,
Yeah.
wow. And George Martin is like, rolling his eyes
Yeah.
whenever he sees that. So there was that tension building in the White Album.
Yeah.
They did with Hey Jude, that was part of the White Album sessions. They went to Trident.
Yeah, I think that was their first 8-track recording, if I remember.
That's
but
right.
They had recorded, I think their first record that they recorded away from Abbey Road was actually Fixing a Hole on
Sgt. Pepper.
Sgt. Pepper. I think that was actually recorded maybe at Trident as well.
It was because they were Abbey Road was still blocking time for other artists, much to the dismay of the Beatles, because they thought they were the only gig in town. And somewhere around Rubber Soul, George Martin left EMI and started his own company called, I think it was like the Associated Independent Recording Producers or something, AIR.
Mm-hmm.
So that was, I think smart on his part.
Yeah.
But the White Album to me is like I think it's my favorite album to listen to,
mm-hmm.
with everything that they did. And again, bringing in all the techniques that they used, the ADT, the wind-up piano on Rocky Raccoon, probably some, the number nine.
The tape loops there, yeah.
Yoko and him, it's like, and then they find you naked. I don't know if you've listened to that recently.
No, I haven't. But I mean, the whole playing it backwards, and it's supposed to say "Turn Me On, Dead Man," and that was one of the clues that McCartney was dead. And
but one of the things is that they also the tape loops, we could say, is really sampling. And so here, when they brought in remember how they would recite the poem like on "I Am the Walrus" or something. That's sampling, and that's what they're doing today. Is that they're taking something else and they're putting. And here are the Beatles ahead of that. And the same thing goes for, I think at the time of Paperback Writer, and probably Rain, is they recorded promotional videos instead of doing live performances to promote their work.
Yeah, they were 20 years ahead of MTV.
Totally.
Yeah. And you talk about sampling in the 60s too. The Mellotron, which you mentioned earlier, the keyboard that was famously used on Strawberry Fields and a couple other tracks that they played on. That was basically an early sampler that actually had rolls of tape inside of it. You press the key and it would actually spin a tape loop over a tape head and would play and then it would spring back when you took it off. So I think Paul still has the original Mellotron that they had. I think he still owns that.
I think Paul has hoarded all of the equipment. And, he still is able to fit into his actual clothes from the 60s. And he recently mentioned that. And I'm thinking, there's going to be like the Paul McCartney Museum one day of all of his stuff. And I will say, with respect to the Beatles instruments, around Rubber Soul, they got the Fender Stratocasters, those blue Fenders, John and George Harrison. And then Paul got the Rickenbacker.
Yeah.
And then they bought the Casino guitars.
Yep.
So another new flavor. And I give credit to Paul. I mean, Paul pretty much plays his same stuff year after year. He's played his Rickenbackers all these years. The Martin D28.
Yeah.
The Hofner, which I'd like him to put the Hofner in its case and put it away.
Yeah.
Bring back the Rickenbacker.
Yeah. Do you prefer the McCartney Beatles bass sound? Do you like the Rick better than the Hofner bass sound?
I believe that I do, though I will say I was listening to the Beatles live at the BBC. It's phenomenal. And if you have a chance, go to maybe YouTube and watch I'm a Loser, because Paul's bass, that was a Freudian slip.
Aging Dr. Freud.
Paul's bass in that is so unbelievable, and how he plays it. He's also distorting some of the notes too, which makes it more interesting. It's a great. I far prefer it to then the recorded version. It's really good, and so we get to Abbey Road, and George Harrison has found out all about the Moog synthesizer on a trip to LA. Someone had it, and so he ordered a fancy one, and it had, you ever see an original Moog, it had like all these panels
it takes a whole room. It looks like an old telephone operator's board where you're literally connecting oscillators through quarter-inch cables, and then it's connecting to your keyboard to make the sounds.
He had two keyboards with it, were 5 octaves, and they used it on Because.
Yep.
They used it a little bit on Maxwell Silver
Hammer. They used it on I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Yeah.
I think
that was
noise.
it was called a white noise generator.
Yep. And of course, Here Comes the Sun too. The little solo in the middle of that is the Moog as well. I don't know if it's Moog or Moog. If people
Moog
say
or
either
Moog,
one,
yeah.
Potato.
Yeah. But they sell some pedals and stuff these days, but it's not quite the same as having. There's like is it called the Grandma? It's like a newer version of the Moog synthesizer. Probably runs about $1,000, but it's like, I think that you love synthesizers. I think you could probably get lost in space with synthesizer heaven.
Especially with all the plugins that are available now that you can get like the entire 1980s keyboard collection on in one thing on your computer and play all these great sounds and I'm sure you can get it just about any keyboard sound from the 60s, 70s, and on through the plugins that are out there now.
Oh, you had made a comment one day when we were fooling around with some of my keyboards, and you said, this would, back in the day, this might cost $250,000, all the sounds that we have on this program.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like the old Fairlight synthesizer in the early 80s was literally $250,000 in 1980 money. And it was just an 8-bit sampler, which is like, your iPhone samples things better than that now. And just the technologies, the change that's come about is just remarkable. I sometimes have this, I go on a fantasy about what if the Beatles in the 60s, somebody transported back and gave them a modern synthesizer and didn't tell anybody, and they just had this secret keyboard that they could what would have come out of them having the technology like a keyboard sound like they have now? What would have come out of them back then with the technology that we have now? I just kind of wonder what that would be like.
Well, I mean, they worked very hard to be new and to be innovative, and even George Harrison released his Wonderwall, the electronic music album, featuring the Moog or the Moog, however you say it. Maybe the challenge is what made them greater, of having to find solutions and to create. Nowadays, it's you could easily put something together with Logic Pro. Has so many built-in loops. I mean, you could do a song where you're not playing anything. It's a very different feeling. What, as a producer and as someone who records others and helps guide them in their music, what do you recommend? What are some things to focus on for folks who want to record their music at home, in the vein of the Beatles, or you're a great songwriter and maybe you want to do something simply? What do you suggest? What's important?
I think what I like to do personally is blend the old with the new. And there's some people that are 100% digital. Everything's online, everything's plugins. And I still, in my studio, I still have an analog mixer right here, which everything goes through first. And I have an analog tube mic preamp. And so even though I record digitally, I still use an outboard synthesizer. I still use real guitars, so I think blending the old with the new is the way I would kind of do it. Is that you can still have all the control and the perfectionism that you're allowed to have with the new technology, but you can still get a different sound. I think that's what, and I probably sound like an old fart here in saying this, but that it's music now that's made all sounds the same because it's all coming from inside of a computer. And so the nuances of a room or of an instrument that made music sound different, and there was variety in music that just isn't there now. And so I think using older equipment and combining the analog with the digital, I think can still help people create an innovative sound that doesn't sound like everyone else. And just I want variety back in popular music in terms of, I'm not talking about the music itself. I'm just talking about the sound of it. And that's kind of hard to explain what I mean by that, but just studios had their own sound. You talk about like
Yes,
Sound
you
City
could-
and
or Sunset. That's
So,
right,
yeah,
Sunset.
all those studios had a sound to them, and you just don't get that anymore with everything being inside of a computer. And so whatever we can do to create uniqueness in how we record and how we capture sound, I'd like to get back to that a little bit more.
So great times.
Yeah, it really was. And I've valued your friendship musically and otherwise all these years. And it's been great. I just love talking Beatles with you, and we could do this for hours, I'm sure, but appreciate you having me on today.
Absolutely. And I thank you so much. And I look forward to maybe we'll record some things and share them and figure them out. And I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. It's a little bit over about an hour and 11 minutes, but that's okay. We've had fun. We hope you've had fun too. And this podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, all the typical podcast platforms. And then it's also, we upload a video on the YouTube channel, so you can watch that and subscribe. And you'll actually get to see us, I think, for this podcast where we're chatting. So Scott, my man, be well, stay safe. Love to you and your family.
Yep, same.
And we will chat again.